in about 1853, Dr. Joseph Leidy, he's a physician, and in fact, everyone in Philadelphia knows him because lots of buildings are named after him, including the biology building at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was very involved in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Anyway, he was wondering what the termites were eating. I mean, he saw them all over that part of Pennsylvania and into the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. He saw, they're called white ants, right? And he just wondered what they were eating. They never seemed to be eating anything. They were just running around their wood all the time. And so he said, and he describes it utterly beautifully. He said, I took one of those termites and I poked a hole in its stomach to see what it was eating. And lo and behold, rushed out a community of swimming animals. It looked like some of my friends rushing out of a crowded meeting house. And he published that paper. And that was 1853, and till 1885, he just was enormously prolific on many subjects, including this one. So if we can get the lights out, I want to show you this video before. Okay, let's see. I think that's all we're going to be able to do without our... Can you see from there, do you think? No? Can you guys see it all? Back? Why don't you people who are not being able to see just move into some of those seats. Come up close because you're just not going to miss it otherwise. No, don't start without lights off. Please, lights off, please. Let's get all the lights off now. Thank you. Okay, now push, start, please. Just move in for this purpose. This is something else, but we're going to go to this in a minute. We'll see. Now, Joseph Leidy described inside the intestine of these termites, and they were later found in Zootermopsis, which is a dampwood termite that you've got around here. He described these plants, and I'm going to show you these plants. First of all, you simply just take any of these white ants or termites. Move in, please, move in so you can see. And you just take them with a little forceps, and with another forceps in the back, something always sticks out of the hind end of a termite. You pull that thing that's sticking out, which turns out to be the hind gut, and then you simply, and this can be done in any classroom extremely easily, you simply take that residue and put a slide cover on it and look under the microscope. And there's an enormous confusion of these animals leaving the meeting house. But in addition, there are these strips in some termites, these long filaments here with dots in them. I don't know if you see them. We're trying very hard to get rid of everything else for these pictures and just concentrate on these long dots with the kind of grayish dots in this long filament. Grayish dots in this long filament. This is what Joseph Leidy called plants, and everything else that was swimming around, of course, he called animals, because just like men and women, he had only two choices. You had to be an animal, or you had to be a plant. And he called these attached plants to the gut, to the intestine wall of termites. And I think you can see that there's some smaller ones here, and here is, let's push it on stop a second, and pause, wonderful. This is Leidy's original plate from his original paper, and he drew, and his were all from the termites in the northeast. He drew these big ones that we just saw, and he noticed that what we would say today, that these plants, so-called, had filaments coming off of them. In other words, the symbionts of the termites have further symbionts. And I want to have you watch this one. This is a very long one. the end down here is stuck into the wall. It's actually stuck into the gut wall. That's because it shouldn't be defecated. The termite is constantly defecating, and he would simply get rid of all these organisms if the organisms didn't have a nice tight connection to the wall of the gut. So you have these long filaments, and notice these guys on the top here, these little symbionts of symbionts. And if we go forward again, Terry, please, you're going to see exactly what Joseph Leidy saw 100 years later, more than 100 years later, 130 years later. You'll see that in a minute. Here's electron microscopy of that same material, and it shows that what he was calling plants are, there it is, you see that? The same filament with the same thing on it. Exactly the same material. The words used to describe it entirely different. The children would all fail the test today if they took it then, and all fail the test then if they took it now. At any rate, it's exactly the same material. The material's unchanged. Here's that stalk, and here are its symbionts. So you have small symbionts on a large one and a large one on the termite. And here are 4 filaments cut through by an electron micrograph with its little ones around it. And here we have one of those filaments just exactly as seen by Leidy. We made no improvements whatsoever on Leidy, except we can see this at higher power. Here's another case of these organisms, and I'm going to tell you, here's another one. These are from now the southwest of the United States, so it's not just in the termites Leidy saw, but it's quite widespread. This Arthromydes material is quite widespread elsewhere. Here are one of the spores. It has these little filaments. The man who first took this picture was looking for sperm. He knew it wasn't sperm. He didn't know what the heck it was. He wrote me this letter and said, I know it's not sperm. What is this stuff? And he showed me sections through this material, which we're going to see in a second. It turns out that those fibers are to hold these organisms to the gut so that they're not defecated out of the animal. Okay, so here's some more pictures. The man was Afzelius, a man from Sweden, who actually sent me his pictures and said, Dear Dr. Margulis, I know I don't have sperm. Can you tell me what the hell I have? I've cut through the termite, and I don't know what this is, and I'm going to show you one of his pictures in a minute. I think his was from this Zootermopsis in California and in Nevada. This is one of the ones you have here. Here's the body that he knew wasn't a sperm head, and here's these little things that he thought might be viruses or something, and he cut through here, and there it is. I mean, isn't that amazing? All that is, those are fibers that hold the spores to the animal, so that when the animal defecates, and all of this activity of the other organisms in the gut that actually digest the wood go on, so that they're not lost. And furthermore, in our restudy of this material, we saw, and this is the last one, some of them have branches. This is true branching. Here's a cell with a branch and a spore, a cell with a branch and a spore, and here we are at the end, attached to the termite hindgut. Okay, we'll stop this now. We turn the lights on, and this is all we need to say for a minute. Okay, this is what I want to tell you. In Joseph Leidy's time, there were only 2 possibilities, plants or animals. There's nothing else. There's no other possibility. Now, clearly those things are not animals, so therefore they're plants, right? Period. There's no way of handling or describing this. So I come into my lab one day with a young student, a wonderful, eager student from Brown University who was spending the summer there. And she knew that we were working with this Arthromydes, which of course turns out to be a bacterium. And she says to me, why is Arthromydes on the cover of the telephone book? And I said, no, Allison, no matter what else you've seen, I guarantee that the last person to see Arthromydes was Joseph Leidy. It's not on the cover of the telephone book. What telephone book? She said, well, the microbiology telephone book. And I said, come on, find it for me, because I know you have to be wrong. And she brought this picture to me, and by God, it looked just like Arthromydes. But it couldn't be Arthromydes, because nobody had described Arthromydes since Joseph Leidy called it a plant in 1880. So what was it? And I couldn't find it. It was the little credit line. I couldn't find it anywhere in the book. I finally found the credit line. That is the person who had taken the picture. And it didn't say anything about what it was. And I found this man. He was in a lot of trouble because he was involved in germ warfare, and everybody was hating him for, that's a whole other story. It was anthrax. This man was working for the army in anthrax. It was, in other words, the picture on the cover were the anthrax bacillus. The anthrax bacillus, which you probably have heard of, can be a very dangerous organism. People get it from sheep. People get it when it has 2 plasmids in it. It has to have these 2 genetic elements in it, and then it can be devastating. It can really kill you. Turns out that anthrax and arthritis are virtually indistinguishable. They're virtually indistinguishable. Well, and then I realized, well, let me go find out something about this anthrax. Why is it so much like arthritis? And I'll just give you the summary statement after a year of working on this material. Anthrax is not a dangerous organism unless it has these genetic elements, these plasmids. Think of them as like viruses in there. Otherwise, the people who work with anthrax on a daily basis are never hurt by it at all, because they simply don't have these plasmids in them. They just get rid of them, so there's no problem. Anthrax and arthritis are both examples of a large class of organisms that live in an animal. And in the anthrax case, people get them from sheep, but there are many other domestic animals you can get it from. And the farm animals can get very sick from anthrax, as you probably know. Arthritis is always in the termites. These organisms are shed into the soil. The spores are shed into the soil. And you're wondering where the big trouble in biology is. Well, it's coming. We did all this work and sent in our organisms in a vial, that is our arthritis organisms, to the American type culture collection, because now they're not plants anymore, they're clearly bacteria. I mean, no matter how you classify, they're clearly bacteria. And we get a letter saying, we won't accept these arthritis, you can't use the name, because when we tried to grow them in a culture medium, grow them in a to identify them, they turn out to be Bacillus cereus, right? In other words, weed bacillus. Read that as weed bacillus. In other words, they turn out to be just everything that everybody knows about, everybody uses all the time. It's just a bacillus, and therefore we can't document or give you this name of arthritis. Now let me see if I can explain to you what the problem is. All the life on Earth, of the 30 million species, have their certain governors. In the case of animals, the governors are zoologists. In the case of plants, the governors are botanical taxonomy that usually comes from Scandinavia. In the case of bacteria, they used to be French. Bacteria used to be French. But the Americans have taken over completely since the 1920s and the publication of what we call the Bergey's Manual. And there was so much poor science that it was decided a long time ago by these bacteriologists that if an organism couldn't be sent to the central place, which happens to be the American type culture collection, and grown in pure culture under defined conditions, the organism was simply denied existence. In other words, it doesn't exist. So arthritis doesn't exist because when they grew it, it came out Bacillus cereus, so we have to change its name to Bacillus cereus. And this has not been resolved. That is, I still have not joined the American Society of Microbiology. I can't join it because they will not recognize the organisms in nature. Now this has extremely serious consequences. What are the consequences? I believe that most of these bacilli in the soil that are easily grown are simply the non-animal phase. All right, the Bacillus cereus and Bacillus subtilis and Bacillus, name me some other bacilli, the big bacilli. Excuse me? Right, that's the favorite one, yeah. Bacillus megaterium. The weeds of the world are of course studyable and of course grown, but we're missing the major point, and that is that those organisms get swallowed by birds and by mammals, and they have a stage that's inside the birds and the mammals. And anthrax isn't just some freaky pathogen. Anthrax is one of a huge group of organisms that get out into the soil and back into animals, out into the soil, back into the animals. And in the case that it picks up these 2 toxin-producing plasmids that I referred to before, it causes diseases, and that's very unusual. Most of the time, it's just back and forth in the soil. We have mentally the idea that there are these germs and they attack and they kill. It's all military analogy, right? The germs, you have a defense against an attacking germ that invades the tissues. We have that kind of metaphor. And we have no way socially of handling the fact that most of these organisms are there in a cycle, because we can't even document the animal part of the cycle, because when we send it to the American Type Culture Collection, it changes name. Now, it was worse when Leidy was around because it was a plant. I mean, it had to go to botany collection. It was a plant. At least they're not a plant anymore. At least there's a bacteria. Now, I would say that customs officers, Carolina Biological, and various other people that have to deal with the classifying of organisms are barely acceptable of the fact that bacteria exist. Basically, there's plants, and that would include algae. There's animals, and that would include everything that runs around. And then there's germs, and that includes things that are bad, right? And germs means everything in the soil, everything in the scummy-looking water, and basically that's people's mental division of all life on Earth. And as a result, we throw out centuries of carefully conceived and studied information, because all the molecular information doesn't make any difference if you've got the 16S RNA and it turns out to be of an alga, and that's a plant anyway. The information is lost. So we have a series of academic officers, that's presidents of universities and deans, and this doesn't matter whether it's education or in the science itself. And they have one interest, that is, they are paid for one kind of success. What kind of success is that? That is increasing the rate of cash flow per square foot of university property or company property. But this is the main intellectual and moral goal of those people by definition in their position. We increase the rate of cash flow, and that means employing people who spend money on enzymes, employing people who spend money on bacteria, on oligonucleotides for PCR reactions and all the rest of that, and absolutely disdaining the people who would go into nature and look at the organisms in the animals, for example. That would cost a whole lot of money and not bring anything into the university. The museum collections are under enormous fire. All museum collections, because they do exactly the opposite. They spend money per square foot and they take up space. What could be worse? So we have these two dichotomies. One is the cash flow per square foot increase of human inhabitation of the campus, of the company, of the city, or whatever it is. What you could summarize as conversion of the ecosystem to urban ecosystem for people, and I would include the entire medical establishment in that, because what is the goal? To increase the health of people. So you increase, because when you increase their health, they simply go and reproduce and make more of themselves. That's a totally biological thing to do. So you're increasing the health of people, the number of people, and therefore the amount of ecosystem on the surface of the Earth converted to human use. Then you have the other people, which are the occasional naturalist, biologist, earth firster, and a whole lot of other types who feel that the ecosystem should be preserved, or in fact converted in some cases, to non-human kind of life. And I've oversimplified it, just like there's not just plants and animals, there's not just cash flow types and what do you call those tree people? Earth firsters, greeners. What are they? Earth first. Yeah, but no, the green. Okay, they're not just green movement. The green movement. You know, they're not just the green movement versus the bankers. I mean, that's the simple way of looking at it. Right? There's not just the economists versus the ecologists, but there's a fundamental problem here, and all scientists work in a milieu, in an environment where the goals and the purposes and the points of view are determined not by the scientists, who are supposedly curious and following the truth, but by the greater social structure in which they survive and which they work, and therefore they are subject to the same kinds of problems. And biology, more than any other science, is a subject to these kinds of problems, because of the 30 million species or so, the 30 million species serve as what? They serve as food, they serve as fiber, sources of clothing, sources of course, all of our food and all of our animal food, such that our responses to any live organism are not simply objects of study for the science of biology, but they're intrinsically involved in our maintenance and growth as human populations. And as a result, there's a terrible intellectual malaise, I would say. There's cognitive dissonance. And I want to make two more points and then I'm going to open it for discussion. The cognitive dissonance, for example, came to a complete head in my particular case when some young gung-ho, wonderful teachers who had decided to go into curriculum and study curriculum and develop some audio visuals of some of these microorganisms that I was showing you. And they came down and they asked Carlene Schwartz and me to do a 5-kingdom unit showing some examples of each of the kingdoms of live material for students. And they came down as employees, representatives of Carolina Biological. And Carlene and I started to do it. We were about 2 weeks into it. When we picked up the Carolina Biological catalog, and we nearly died. Joseph Leidy's bacteria were still in the plant kingdom, and not just Joseph Leidy's. All the bacteria were in the plant kingdom, all the algae were in the plant kingdom, and all the protists were called protozoa, and they were in a phylum in the animal kingdom. In other words, the entire catalog was what I've been spending the last 25 years of my life fighting. That is this dichotomous view, communist, non-communist, male, female, good, bad, germs, okay, plants, animals. You know, that is this phony split that doesn't apply to these lower organisms, instead of recognizing that the bacteria aren't plants at all, they're bacteria, and the protoctists are not plants or animals, they're their own thing, like we saw in the film some of you saw. Who was there last night? Well, those of you, I can depend on recognizing this throbbing cytoplasm is not plant and not animal, and it needs to be respected. Okay, so we called these people back and said, we can't do this. We can't put a 5-kingdom audiovisual in a catalog that's split down the middle on plants and animals. And they said, oh, you know, you're completely right, but this company, we don't run the company. We just work for it, you know. But we'll go back and we'll talk to them. They went back and talked to the company, and they said, are you kidding? Put the bacteria in their own kingdom? We'd have to change the labels. We'd have to change the drawers. It would cost about $40,000 to change the catalog. We'd have to change our posters. We can't do that. Sorry. So Carlene and I said, we can't work for Carolina Biological. And that's what happened. And we ended up working for Ward's because Ward's had already done a 5-kingdom poster without us even having anything to do with it. So when it comes to the flexibility of those companies, but the Ward's people remind me that they're 10 times smaller than Carolina. They're much smaller. They're much more modest a company than Carolina. At any rate, these decisions affect customs officers and agricultural officers, and they affect everybody. And I have one more story about it, and that is these throbbing organisms, which some of you didn't see, are even in a worse situation. Amongst them, and this is this Protoctista. I'm not even going to show my slides because we don't have time, but it's these, you clearly can see bacteria. Everybody has some sense of bacteria. And everybody has some sense of plants and animals. And when I tell you that fungi, it's quite obvious, are these molds and mushrooms and puffballs and shelf fungi. And, excuse me, the most common one is this agaric campestris, the thing that we buy in the grocery store all the time. In other words, mushroom, common mushroom. That's quite clear that that thing's not really a plant, and you know they produce all these hallucinogenic compounds. And I mean, it's all right to take the fungi out as plants. And the fungi people did that a long time ago. They said they're not green, they don't photosynthesize, they have their own really bizarre life cycle, they have a crazy sex life. It's all right, let's let the fungi out. So they move the fungi out. So you have the fungi people feeling fine, and the plant people saying, okay, our plants begin with embryos, and we have some sense of plants. They're green, every kid can tell what a plant is, more or less. And then we have animals, and they all form from an egg and a sperm, and the egg and sperm get fertilized. And we have the marine animals and I hate the word invertebrate. It makes it sound like there's only two possibilities, you know, people and invertebrates, people and squishies. But of course, there are 30 phyla of these animals, and they can all the worms and the deep sea tube worms and all of that. So, all right, pretty people are pretty much comfortable with that. The problem the real disenfranchisement is not the women, and it's not the blacks. It's the 250,000 species of organisms that don't fit those four categories, that just are not plants, are not animals, are not fungi, and are not bacteria. They're all nucleated organisms, but they don't fall in any of those categories. Now, everyone has claimed them, and this is where the big trouble is. Everyone has claimed them. The mycologists say they're mine, they look like fungi. The plant people say they don't run around, they're not animals, they have to belong to me. The veterinary medicine people say, oh, well, they cause diseases, therefore disease organisms, therefore they're germs, therefore they belong to me. Let me name you some of the famous ones. Unfortunately, all the famous ones cause diseases on people, otherwise they wouldn't be studied at all. Giardia causes that, that intestinal sickness. The most common one in this room, probably by a factor of 10 to the 8th, is Trichomonas vaginalis, the cause of most vaginal itch amongst people. The malarial parasite, the trypanosome, the sleeping sickness organism that cause, can we think of any more that belong to this group? The red tide dinos that cause the fish toxins. Amoeba that cause the amoebic dysentery. These organisms have a bad name. I've named the freaks. There are 250,000 species. In other words, there are more species of these organisms than there are of fungi, and then there are of bacteria. There are more species of those organisms. Those organisms have never had anyone to defend them at all. They only have bad name because occasionally some of them are freaks. That is, some of them are pathogens and some of them have terrible effects on people. Then what happens, the molecular biologists get a hold of those organisms and they study them and they find, oh my God, they're so different from animals and plants. Well, sure they're different. You called them a little animal because you had no other categories. Then they find out that they're different, and they don't know what to do. The molecular biologists who recognize that they're different think they've made this glorious discovery. What they've done is ignored 200 years of work telling you that they weren't animals to begin with. They weren't plants to begin with, so it's not surprising that they're different. All I'm saying is that the social organization of people and the biological organization of organisms is not at all one-to-one. The social organization is completely determined by economic and social forces. The biological organization is determined by the evolution and history of the organisms. And the biologists to which Terry referred, that is the neo-Darwinian jocks, know nothing about the organisms at all. They also know nothing about geology, atmospheric chemistry, and all sorts of other things you need to know in order to study evolution. And so we have what Lovelock has beautifully called academic apartheid. We have a situation in academia where the groupings are reflecting the history, the social forces, and as they say at Harvard, the tubs on their own bottom. In other words, the budget lines, basically. Whereas the organisms are representing a completely different kind of evolution and origin, and as a result, we're running into big headlong problems. My very last story is the following. The most unfortunate committee task, it makes coming here look like a total pleasure, which it is, of course, but this committee task that is just devastating to me is being a member of the Harvard University Visiting Committee for Biology. Why? Because it's the microcosm where all of these social forces are most acutely noticed. Harvard University Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology, a place with unbelievable history. The head of the Economic Botany Museum has 26,000 samples of medicinal plants and economic plants in general from all over the world. The wood collection alone is about 30,000 pieces or something of well-identified materials. The type specimens have been banked there since the 1700s, etc. That department has 17 job openings. Why can't Harvard fill the 17 job openings? Because exactly of the big trouble that I'm telling you. If the person who comes to apply for that job opening is a museum type, he's no good because he's going to waste space and he's going to not do anything except catalog organisms. If he comes as a molecular biologist, he's no good because he doesn't know anything about any of the organisms. He simply knows how to spend money on enzymes. As a result, the tensions have led to an impasse. When the Harvard people wonder what they've done wrong, all they are doing is reflecting the big trouble in the academic world versus the world that needs people who know this diversity on an accurate level. Harvard is just reflecting that problem. So I've given you some idea of the problems which are far beyond the classroom and far beyond the little academic squabbles and have great ramifications in our behavior as people. One of only 30 million species of organisms. That's all I want to say, and let's just ask questions, of course. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, undoubtedly you're familiar with Carl Rose's work on
Oh, sure.
I don't find the pessimism that you find for this approach in the fact that you can take the ribosomal RNA and find hot spots in it and not so hot spots in it.
Oh, yeah.
And essentially get an evolutionary picture. And it faces the problem that you talked about in that we can only grow a certain percent of the mass, living mass on the face of the earth.
Oh, I want...
Manual got in trouble with that.
Right.
Now, with this procedure of making some kind of evolutionary pattern,
Sure.
certainly it gives us hope that we can actually
Identify things.
organisms we can't grow and classify them.
You're completely right, and you're at a different level completely from this talk. I mean, completely right. No, you don't want to get into that. And I want to tell everybody what that's about, because I don't mean to have pessimism. On the contrary, I completely and 100% share what you said. And what's your name?
Boudreaux, George Boudreaux.
Yeah, hi, yeah. George Boudreaux is explained to us is that these molecular techniques are not like all bad. They're not just to move cash, not at all. And one of the most wonderful aspects of them are that they allow one to look at macromolecules, large molecules that are shared by all life, whether they be bacteria, plants, animals, protoctis, fungi, or another kind of bacteria. And since all life have these same molecules that run the protein synthesis, one can make direct comparisons about those molecules in all life and come out with relationships among all life. And what is really exciting is that we can do this in certain special cases when the organisms cannot be grown. In other words, if we can see the organisms, for example, the termite, which has this great mixture of stuff and most of it can't be grown, we can actually identify whether arthromyces is Bacillus cereus and so on. And I am not in the least, I mean, the last thing I would do is get up and denigrate those techniques. I think they're fantastic, and I think that they give us every reason for optimism, but they don't go at the really structural problem of the social organization of biologists. So I just don't think that they're, I agree with you is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Michael Rothschild's book, Bionomics.
Terry, you want to hear that from her? Now you listen? I am. What did you say the subtitle is?
Economy is ecosystem.
Now listen, I think it's really wild because when that book came out in hardback, the subtitle was The Inevitability of Capitalism. And I wrote and told them, I won't say anything about this book with that subtitle. And when you finish reading the book, that's not what the book is saying at all. The book is saying that small groups that determine their own destiny are much more powerful and much stronger than when the destiny is determined by some board of directors outside. That's his main point. That's one of his main points. And so he doesn't mean capitalism in the sense that it looks like on that title. They made him change the title. I mean, or they let him change the title. I strongly recommend this book. I think this book is a really thoughtful contribution to the application of biological and ecosystem thinking to human economics. It's wonderful. And what I think even more strongly is that I don't know whether the guy talks, but I would find out from his close, I mean, you know how to do that, find out whether he can give a speech, because I think what his message is extremely profound and very well researched. It's called Bionomics, and this is kind of biology, economics recombination. So he means the biology of economics. And what's the subtitle again, please? Economics as ecosystem. And what he shows is when money and resources have to flow, like from the government to the schools, there's this biological parasitism that is inevitable, namely those who get their hooks into that flow will siphon off that money. And he just shows a lot about how control and governing is related to the flow of resources, and it's a very biological analysis of social situations.
I just wanted to add that he has established a Bionomics Institute in San Rafael, and I do have some reprints of things that explain this.
I think he would be an absolutely ideal person for this series if he can speak as well as he can write, because he writes very, very well. Yeah, well, I don't know. Yeah. Michael Rothschild, and I did ask by writing once if he were related to the Baron and all the Miriam Rothschild and Sir Lord Rothschild, who Walter Rothschild was probably one of the most important biologists in that family, of which a century ago, well, no, a generation ago, 50% of them were biologists. Lord Rothschild is the founder of major museums in England. He answered, unfortunately, is unrelated entirely to that family. Yeah. Yes.
Can you say a word where viruses fit into this? And is enough known about them to really classify them?
I think enough is known about them. Viruses, when they are not in contact with their various hosts, behave exactly like chemicals. They behave like sodium chloride. They do absolutely nothing ever. If you change the temperature, their temperature changes. In other words, they're entirely passive. They have no metabolism, and they have no homeostasis at all. The only times viruses act is when they can, in a recognition act, recognize their hosts, and their hosts may be animals, plants, fungi, protoctus, any of those, bacteria, and they get inside, and then they utilize the machinery and physiology of their hosts. Therefore, viruses, I think everybody feels, are much more related to their hosts than they are to each other. And I would think of a virus, ordinary virus, the way you think of a computer virus. You don't have a computer virus without a computer. Well, you don't, and a computer virus, of course, is related to its computer. In the same way, viruses are related not to each other, but to the organisms from which they derive, and therefore they don't deserve kingdom status. They deserve study, of course, but they're completely interactive, and I would never call them parasites. To me, that just completely obscures it pretends to give them the dignity of an individual organism status, which they don't have. I think of them as parts. It's like calling your fingernails an organism. I mean, they're parts of bacteria or parts of animals. So the AIDS virus becomes not an individual organism capable of self-maintenance and organization, self-maintenance of its organization. It is a part of humans. It's human. It's a piece of human. Yeah.
In the flyer here, it discusses autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis?
What is that?
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about right now. Quite a number of years ago, I'd say in the early 70s, several biologists got pretty upset by the definition. I mean, when I was a student, definition of life was something that replicated, mutated, and passed on its mutations by replication. And I think today we would see that completely wrong. That would mean that no grandmother's alive because there's no more reproduction. No mule is alive because it's not fertile. And that molecules in a test tube which replicate, there's no doubt that DNA in a test tube can replicate, are alive. And that viruses which clearly replicate are alive. So what do you do? Do you just say grandmothers are dead and viruses and the DNA in a test tube is alive, or do you say there's something wrong with your definition? And these people felt there's something very wrong with the definition. And they devised a systems theory type of definition of life. And they called it auto is from self, of course, and poiesis is from poetry. And poiesis simply means making, generating. So self-generation. And the concept of autopoiesis is that an autopoietic entity, whether that's a cell or whether it's an animal or whether it's a fungus or whatever, an autopoietic entity is something that interchanges its parts all the time and maintains its boundary with that maintains an inside and an outside by a boundary, and that boundary can be skin or membrane or anything, but that boundary is maintained by the interaction of the parts on the inside. So it's, in other words, it's an entity that maintains a certain level of organization. And that's why when an organism dies, it has the same DNA 5 minutes after death. It has the same DNA, it has the same RNA, it has the same components, but the components have lost their interaction and their organization, which is a function of the history. And so by focusing on that interaction of the components, the autopoietic definition makes it very clear that viruses are not autopoietic and grandmothers are, and it's a more satisfactory definition of life. Lovelock feels that we probably can't ever define life, though. He thinks that's in our evolution, because what we have to know is, do we mate with it? Is it edible? Is it poisonous? Is it going to hurt us? Those are the things we have to know about any life, and those become much, much more important than whether or not it's alive in some philosophical sense. So maybe we'll never define life, but at any rate, autopoiesis to me is a much better definition than replication and mutation. Yeah.
What about archaeobacteria that are thought not to be bacteria anymore?
Well, this is Boudreaux? Yeah, exactly what this gentleman was referring to. Woza and his army of co-workers, half of which or more are in Germany, has developed these techniques, which are extremely powerful techniques, to look at all organisms that have the ability to synthesize their own proteins. One of the things, just with respect to autopoiesis, is that the ability to synthesize proteins using ribosomes is part of the autopoietic system. It's lacking in viruses. It's present in grandmothers. There's another case here. Now, the archaeobacteria, what's been revealed by these macromolecular analyses is, again, something I think that was known, at least intuitively to some extent, and that is the diversity amongst the bacteria is far greater than the diversity among plants, animals, and the rest of it. I mean, plants and animals are virtually identical by these criteria. So not only is there an enormous diversity among bacteria, which I think was realized by those who study these organisms, but what was not realized, and for which Woza deserves every kind of credit, is that the bacteria, that is, the organisms with prokaryotic level of organization, fall into two groups. The ones they call eubacteria, which are the ones we're mostly accustomed to, all the bacilli and these arthromites and everything else we've been talking about. And then another group, which is pretty obscure, and that group is they're methane making, they're salt tolerant, and they're thermoacidophiles, in other words, high temperature sulfur maintaining. Now, amongst that latter group, there seems to be they seem to have diverged a long time ago in terms of their differences. That group tends to be quite different from the rest of the bacteria. So not only is there this huge spread among the bacteria, but there's some organisms that might even be considered very distantly related from the rest of the bacteria. That last statement is under a lot of fire. The so-called archaeobacterial group is quite different from the other group, I think. That's quite clear, but whether or not they even form a completely cohesive group is up for question. But we now have insights by measuring molecules that are present in all of them that are much, much more valuable as clues to the organisms than, for example, whether or not it can grow on a sugar or whether it swims away with a flagellum. In other words, these are genetic, much more than superficial types of characteristics. And archaeobacteria is the name given to the three I mentioned, the salt, the methane, and the thermoacidophiles. That's the name given to that group. Woza wants, in what I consider a totally political ploy, wants to call them archaea to claim they're no longer bacteria. And I think most of the bacteria people and all the biologists would say that as far as their organization and their structure is concerned, they are unambiguously bacteria. They are completely bacteria. So he wants to privilege this RNA molecule over all the other features. So structurally, these things are bacteria, without a doubt. It's just that they're quite different. They're generally different from the other bacteria that superficially look like them.
Do you think they're ancestral to bacteria, or do you think they're unique?
I think that it's that the jury is out on that. If you look at the ATPases of the archaebacteria and proteins of the archaebacteria, you come out unambiguously that they fall right in with the rest of the bacteria. So age becomes a whole other issue. See, what happens is people say, since it's very different, and since they grow under conditions that are like the early Earth, therefore they're old. And I would say that's not logical. The only thing you can say is that since they are very different, they are distantly related. But the question of how old and how it has to do with the rate of change. And there's nothing that you can do with live organisms now, per se, that tells you about the rate. When they go to calibrate the age, they have to do with what everybody else has to do, and that is calibrate it against the direct evidence of the fossil record. And the problems is those bacteria look like little dots in the fossil record, so you don't know. I mean, what they want to do is, again, dismiss all paleontology, because they don't know any, so they dismiss it. Very common thing. You just don't know it, so you don't count it. You discount it, literally discount it. And so those kinds of people that work with these things tend to discount it unless it becomes convenient for them, and then they count it. So I don't think we can say anything about the age, whether archaebacterial. Yeah.
Maybe I'm a little dense this morning, but
You mean maybe I'm confusing? Is that what you mean?
well, let me ask a question. The topic is somewhat the trouble in biology, and it seems to be largely to do with definitions. I just don't see
Oh, no, it doesn't.
trouble in where you're going with that.
No, it's not definitions.
It's almost like semantics.
It's not semantics, because the trouble, what I'm trying to show you, is that the definitions are reflecting a view of the Earth. One view of the Earth is people should continue to grow and change the natural ecosystem to make room for more people, who should make more room for more people, who should make room for more healthy people, at the total expense of all of forests and grasslands and agricultural land and every other kind of land. This is one basic view. The other basic view is that we share the planet with other organisms with whom we should not only respect, but understand and respect. Those are two diametrically opposed views, and what happens is people, in compartmentalizing and doing what you're calling semantics, avoid the problem that way. Just like the people who want to have beautiful gardens and lots of land for their own children don't see any connection with that, between that and zero population growth and abortion. I mean, they think that we can have it all. I'm saying that the problem is easy to fight over semantically, but the problem itself is certainly not semantic at all. It's fundamental and it's deep, and it has to do with fundamental value systems. And now I'd like you to answer see if I've made myself clear.
Yes, it's a lot clearer than most of the rest of the discussion.
Uh-huh.
And I would now ask my question,
You're right.
which is, and now I understand there are these diametrically opposed forces.
And they hide behind the semantics, is what I'm saying.
Yes, and you hid very well today for me. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because we're debating who belongs in which kingdom.
Right.
And that's the trouble in biology, as you just stated.
Right.
So I'm asking, if I might, how does one mediate between these diametrically
Get
opposed
them to
forces? Where is the common ground? What is the nature of the common ground? How can people engage in reshaping or examining policy other than saying you're right on this right side or you're wrong
on the left side?
Where is the overlap, or is there no overlap?
Oh no, I mean, I think your question is very profound and very important, and of course there's no simple answer. But one of the major answers, though, is to face the issue and not hide behind by making arbitrary divisions, academic apartheid, using inappropriate labels, and all of the other things. Now, facing the issues involve talking directly about what we're doing, keeping alive at any cost premature babies, for example. There's a very clear-cut case. We know that when babies are born at 3 months instead of 9, or 4 months instead of 9, that their prognosis for success, that is success, their prognosis for straight economic burden on their family, and if not the family, on the society at large, is enormous. we know that there is a direct relation between the rate of population growth and the rate of deforestation. Those are not independent, unconnected things, except maybe in the minds of our president, who just doesn't seem to be any connection whatsoever. I mean, our president doesn't seem to see that there's any connection between human population growth and the rate of destruction of forests. I think one of the major, most important things is to call a spade, and that means call a fungus and not a plant, which I was trying to explain. In other words, to be very appropriate and not consider semantics, these classification things, which obscure the real issues about what these organisms are in relation to people. And we have to recognize our relationship with the rest of nature. And I'm sorry if it was obscure to you, but I certainly was trying to be blunt.
Well, maybe if the audience doesn't mind, may I follow up?
Sure, go ahead.
I have a good friend who's engaged, working in Congress, and he is engaged in trying to deal with some of the problems that face Oregon right now.
Mm-hmm.
You have these diametrically opposed groups. You know, you have the endangered owl and you have the economic timber.
Right.
And in trying to grapple with that issue, it's clear that you cannot serve both masters.
You can't.
But you must, because you're in Congress, right? You've got to do something.
Well, if you choose to go to Congress.
You do something or nothing. And we all know that nothing is less desirable than something, even if something is slightly misguided.
Well, nothing is doing something. I mean, you do something by doing nothing, of course.
And the question I posed to him in a drafting situation is, what are you trying to maximize? Now, I'm not sure that's the right question. I certainly lost it when I asked that question. But from my scientific perspective, you are forced, the only way one can deal with blunt, distant forces is to try and say, we will maximize something. Maybe that maximization is diversity. Maybe that maximization is survival of existing species. Maybe that maximization is human well-being in the short term.
Sure. Well, I think the latter is what everybody is.
Maximization is profits for certain powerful people.
Right.
Do you have any comments about what a useful maximization principle might be that finds the middle ground?
Well, I know the last two that you mentioned I find repulsive. But, yeah, for example. No, I wouldn't simplify. I mean, we have to go into all of the issues, but my personal feeling is that humans are mammalian weeds with enormous abilities to deceive themselves. I mean, that's the one thing that really distinguishes people, is that they can talk and believe what they say, which is, I mean, you don't get a dog to do that. A dog knows that it's either food or plastic, and he knows he wants the food. And people have convinced themselves that money, for example, is food. There are people that really do confuse green linen paper with water, for example. And that's an enormous mistake, and it's very easy for people to make. I think we'd have to, talk about that in detail. I can't stand up in one sentence and say that I would maximize any given quantity of something, except maybe education. Yeah.
I realize you don't need any defense, but I really want to say I don't agree that what you said was obscure at all.
Well, it depends on if you're a biology teacher, I mean, if all these words are all new to you, I can see how they can be very annoying. In fact, that's what keeps a lot of physicists and chemists and mathematicians from going into biology, because they decide that all biology is a semantic argument about the words and names. And I think that biologists, we do deserve a little bit of blame for that, and it's a shame that we have obfuscated it. It's very hard not to, given the diversity of life. Pardon?
The ones you were talking about today are ones that, when you're working in any area in the sciences, you face exactly the same thing. And I would further advise the fact that the forces that you're identifying are operating at a point of literally subverting most of the work that's going on, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. It's very hard to teach in classes now and not talk about these issues solely as opposed to some of the science issues, because it's as though you cannot address some of them. They're being
Which are the issues that you're referring to right now when you say these issues?
things such as differences of opinion, things that are being traded politically for not being able to be worked on, things such as that. The molecular issues as opposed to the naturalist sorts of issues.
Right.
I mean, those are simply small issues in science.
but they reflect a much larger problem. I mean, the molecular issues, people all like the molecular stuff in general because, first of all, I can just tell you from painful first-hand experience, it costs from 10 to 100 times more money to train a molecular biologist student than any other because that student has to make orders to companies and buy equipment and materials and supplies and even capital equipment. And as a result, the pressures on biologists to simply spend are enormous, and they're never discussed in a philosophical way at all. They're just we just take them for granted. So, no, I mean, I completely agree with you. Yeah, back there, yell.
With my brief reading about Gaia theory, it seems that the main views are winged tasks by algorithm.
I can't hear what you said.
My reading about Gaia theory seems to views are winged tasks on been accusing you of promoting altruism. That's a dirty word in evolutionary theory.
It should be a dirty word. It doesn't apply to biology. Yeah.
What you said last night, and what I want to ask is what other paradigm would you suggest for evolutionary theory seems so caught up in cost and benefit, and these words you said really shouldn't apply. So could you suggest a different paradigm?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you, of course. And the problem is that, well, let me just give you a metaphor, an analogy. Richard Evans Schultes was the best economic botanist in the world who deals with hallucinogenic plants of South America. Came and he's an emeritus at Harvard, and he's, of course, subject to all of he has to be replaced. He's one of those 17 job openings that is for his replacement. And last week, when we were doing his stuff on South American hallucinogens, he said to me, Lynn, I just want to tell you something. I don't like this idea of taking the fungi out of the plant kingdom. I mean, after all, they're not animals. They really do belong in the plant kingdom. And in the same way, I love Schultes, but he will never change that opinion. Science will march on without him. And I have to tell you the same thing about the Dawkinses and the Maynard Smiths and the rest of it. Science is going to march on without them. You're not going to change their paradigm. They're going to die off and be replaced by people who have a different and more wide and more knowledgeable training. Because I would claim that the evolutionary biologists whom, as you point out, run all the funds. I mean, they have kept me from getting funds my entire career. They say I'm not an evolutionary biologist, and they're right in that sense. I'm not. I agree, and I'm proud of it. I mean, I'm not even, it took me a long time to say that in public, but I am. Those people just have to go through their demise and be replaced. And as they're replaced, the people who are more into the Gaia metaphor, the Gaia paradigm, or whatever you want to call it, are people who recognize the acuteness of the need to learn something about the volcanic gases and other atmospheric gases, their sources in their sinks. They need to know about the sedimentary rocks and to know about their relation between the trapping and binding microbes that produce these sediments. They just need to cross the bounds of academic apartheid, because without these other fields, and the major ones are chemistry and geology. What is that? That's natural history. When you get biology, chemistry, and geology, you're back to natural history. Well, without that kind of reintegrative sort of approach, you're going to get caught up with silly arguments about whether or not, when I pee, I'm being altruistic toward the ammonia-oxidizing bacteria, which is a silly argument. Okay, one more question. Well, I think that Terry says that Terry runs my life for the next 2 days. I mean, till 1 o'clock this afternoon. Wait, one more question?
One more.
Okay, sure.
Okay, I teach at the beginning biology class at the college level, and I get lots of students who indeed are interested in trying to integrate the whole natural world. They say, what shall I go into? And I say, gee, what are your choices? Maybe molecular biology. Do you want to be a geologist? What kind of advice would you give to somebody who is starting and really has an interest in integrating a lot of fields with the current state of academia?
Well, it's a terribly hard question, and I can't give them any good advice, because good advice would mean that they would commit academic suicide, right? So you can't ask them to do that. I tell my students who are all studying symbiosis in some form or another never to tell anyone they're studying symbiosis, because the attitude, if it's symbiotic, it must be good. If it's good, don't fix it, therefore don't pay for it. So that there's absolutely no support for symbiotic research whatsoever. So we have to change it to be parasitism, and then all of a sudden money's there, right? It's exactly the same field. Anyway, what you have to do is see what they should be. I think it's quite good advice that they get very solid training and very solid education in at least one science. In other words, they should really have a good chemistry background, or a good biology background, or a good physics background, or a good geology background, because you need the rigor of one discipline. But since biology is so fragmented, what you say after that? What you say after that is you have to find the programs that are doing these kinds of things, and I can only identify maybe 2 or 3 of them. One is, at the graduate level, the Yale School of Forestry. There's no doubt about the quality of that for integrative biology. It is a superb program. Botkin up here in Santa Barbara, environmental studies. Now that program is less rigorous from the point of view being defined within a field of science. And I could probably give you about 5 or 6 others. So what you have to do is find the ongoing programs. NASA runs some summer programs, for example, in global ecology, right? But you have to be qualified for them. So what you have to do is find the 15 to 20 programs that exist and get your students hooked up in some way, good students especially, with those programs, because those students are not going to generate the programs. The students have to find the programs, just like you might be able to find a good mate, but it's very hard to make one.
Great